It came as a shock because we've always had a very thorough and very rigorous testing regime. But as we hear today, when you start to talk about organised crime, when you start to think about the sophistication of drugs and how the scientists are ahead of the testers, and that there's tests that can't actually catch particular sorts of drugs, then you do have to rely on intelligence gathering. So we've done everything we can, but we can do more.
Welcome to the Westminster tradition, where we are unpacking lessons for the public service, starting with the Robodebt Royal Commission. My name is Alison Lloyd-Wright. I'm a South Australian public servant, and I'm here on Kaurna land. And joining me today are two recovering public servants, Caroline Crozer-Barlow.
Hello, Alison.
Hello. And from Good Government Advisory, Danielle Elston.
Hello, Alison.
Hello, hello. So in the last two episodes, we have talked about the Essendon Footy Supplement scandal, both about what went wrong with the governance inside the Essendon Footy Club, as well as unpicking the investigative process that leads to 34 Essendon players being suspended for 2 years, while Cronulla players got 6 matches. In this episode, we thought we might dig deeper into some of the more general questions that this incident poses for regulators. But before we do that, Caroline, can you give us a quick recap?
Yeah, look, the story we told over the last few episodes was so complicated that we didn't have time to dig into the regulatory questions raised. But by way of a quick recap, it involves an Australian Crime Commission investigation launching a suggestive report about doping and organised crime in our top leagues. Essendon then self-reports
Not in the way that some of us might hear the word suggestive, but yes.
It's funny because my show notes officially said evocative, but I felt suggestive was better. But welcome another adjective. Essendon then self-reports to the AFL that maybe something untoward has happened, who worked with ASADA on an investigation. The AFL use their contractual powers to compel interviews and make their own findings, again using their constitution, about Essendon bringing the game into disrepute. ASADA then investigate for over a year before charges are laid. WADA appeal, and they appeal because it's a test case of using circumstantial evidence with no positive drug test, and the Essendon players are found guilty. Now, all of this happened in what you have to say is a febrile atmosphere of claims and counterclaims and political conspiracy theories that it was all made up by a desperate Gillard government to try and save the day. And that really was the context.
All right. So, Danielle, you're our sort of in-house regulator. What were some of the issues this story flagged for you?
Oh, look, I think we can all agree jack of all trades with a minor in regulation would be my kind of CV. But I do have a lot of interest in regulation, and I think one of the things this really raised for me is the challenge of regulators in meeting community and industry expectations. And so the community want two contradictory things. They want low regulation, they want government out of their business and getting on with themselves until they're hard done by. And then they want the full force of like a law or a government to come in and solve it for them. And so here ASADA really had an underdone regulatory framework. They didn't have the power to compel evidence. They didn't have the level of resourcing, and I'll get to resourcing I think in a minute. Lots of regulators find this balance really difficult. And if it's an individual complainant, this is an institutional issue. I mean, it's a team. I suppose they were all individuals within it. They were all individually charged, I suppose. But there was also a collective nature of it in some ways because they had the club considering their interests. But individuals tend to think if there's a regulator and a person or a business hasn't done exactly the right thing, the expectation is that there'll be a consequence for that, not education for that person, not a free ride. There is an expectation that something will happen. And so regulation is often about fairness, like about a level playing field and fairness, which in this case is interesting because if Essendon were taking something very performance enhancing, the other stakeholder in this is all the other teams, right? So it is unfair to them, especially teams perhaps that have lost to them or if there's anything around that. So that the people doing the right thing are often not considered as much in a regulatory framework as they could be.
Yeah.
So if rules say everyone must have an individual learning plan or you have to have a licence to fix a front door or you have to drive at 60 k's an hour, then everyone doing that, paying for their licence, lining up, filling out a form, and they might I don't know what the point of this form is, has a really strong vested interest in everyone else who got to work on time because they just thought they'd just scoot through at 71 or whatever else, has this really big vested interest in government making it fair, which is fine, but regulators are never resourced to catch every single person doing the wrong thing, and certainly not every slight misdemeanour. So they have tenors of harm reduction and risk mitigation where catching someone doing 63 is different to catching someone doing 100 in a zone, or where the harm might be really great, like the safety of children. That harm is really great. And so we operate as governments with a risk tolerance, but the community doesn't. It just says there are rules. And I find some of them annoying, but I do my best to meet them. So people who are not putting that effort in should be, there should be consequences for them. Yeah, punished. I mean, I don't want to use punished.
I want punished. No, I want punishment. I was late. I want that person who's meant to be punished.
So I really, really think it's tricky for governments to get regulatory frameworks right, because what regulators are doing is they don't necessarily have all the resources to go after everyone, and they don't necessarily want to. So they are looking at how do they make sure everyone...
think they necessarily should, right? No. We don't need uniform enforcement. The threat of random compliance and enforcement is usually sufficient to drive people's behaviour in the right direction.
Yeah, so they are thinking, does everyone know the rule in the first place? How do we make sure everyone knows that you're not supposed to take this, or that you're supposed to write this or fill out this form? They're thinking, how do we make it as easy as humanly possible? A number of years ago, about 10 or 15 years ago, we were very into something called better regulation, which we still have, but it seems to have a different meaning, which was a lot about the principle of most people want to comply, so lots of education for if you are, I forgot to renew this, there's risk tolerances built in. And then the second part of that was putting a lot of resources into prosecuting egregious breaches and then doing a lot of comms around them to create that environment that you were talking about before, Alison, which is if you don't do the right thing, we will kind of be able to prosecute you. And so that creates, in some ways, a bit of a fear that can happen.
We might catch you, and when we do, you'll be in trouble.
And so that's kind of how a lot of regulatory systems that we're using today were built. They were built with the idea of not catching everybody. Where I will then get to, though, is robo-debt, which is that's exactly what they didn't want to do. They flipped it to use the ICT system because they did want to catch everybody. So there was not built into it that kind of risk tolerance of we will not catch everyone who forgot or put the wrong number or inverted something. They switched it to being a blanket. We will find everyone who has done the wrong thing, and if there is like slippage around the sides of catching people who didn't, we'll sort that out afterwards. So how we build these systems and what the community expects. So the person who's filling out their fortnightly thing and doing the right thing and at Centrelink, they also were a stakeholder in anyone who maybe did not do that. So I do think when we've been talking about it in this sense, we've been talking about how you are regulated as opposed to the people around you doing the right thing who have this interest in government using its powers to, as Caroline said, punish people who are not doing the right thing.
It's super interesting because it makes me think about, because let me put my cards on the table and we'll probably get here a bit later. I'm not convinced that this was the right regulatory framework to take on Essendon, right? Like I think I'm not convinced that an approach that targets individual players for their violation of an anti-doping code really got to the core of what was going wrong in this context. But if you think about the context of was everyone else doing the right thing? Big question mark on that one in the AFL context, right? We talked a little bit about how the regulator here got a little bit funneled and captured by the AFL's interest in sort of locking down the investigation to be in one particular place. So there's something there. But I think it did get really caught in that narrative, Danielle, of sort of if someone has done the wrong thing, they must be punished. Like there must be a kind of yes, right, wrong thing, and that no one could kind of leave the space for the nuance of maybe we've done the right thing or maybe we've done the wrong thing. So like I feel you on the the tensions between people wanting black and white and actually the world being a little bit grey. But I'm interested, what do you think, how do you think this kind of dynamic played out in this case, this dynamic of sort of trying to be softer touch and more educative, which we were doing about 15 years ago, and better regulation, and then just doing exemplary punishment as kind of, as Alison says, a bit of random exemplary punishment is quite helpful because it reminds everyone to behave.
Well, Caroline, you're also...
Sorry, was 2 years suspension soft touch?
Well, not in the end, right? No. Absolutely not. They were the random exemplary person, right? I think is the thing.
Yes, of course. Yes.
Yeah, definitely
but
not.
Again, I do think that we forget that ministers, whilst regulators might be independent, and of course everyone's got a different act, so can everybody before the emails, everyone is slightly different. And again, if I was boss of the world, we'd do a lot of lining up our regulatory systems to not be just slightly different on every act because it would be easier for people to engage with us. However, I'm not. And so they are all slightly different. But for most of them, it's appropriate for a minister, for instance, to say, I will get the regulator to look into that. So I'm going to get the ACCC to look into that. I'm going to refer that to a commissioner to look into it. Now, heaps of things. I can heaps and heaps of them at the Commonwealth level and at the state levels. Now, the independence is in what is found, like what is found from that. But it's actually, there's nothing wrong with it. But that does also add this layer of, that sets the tone. So if a minister says, look into it, they might not have said anything else.
Yeah.
But it's clear then that the government has a view that they'd like the regulator to be more in a space, more in a particular space. The minute a government says that out loud, or a minister says it out loud, a regulator is being given the steer that they would like to be focusing on the blue things, not the green things anymore, because they think that's where the harm is. Now, that harm can sometimes just be talk back radio, not real harm. And so it's not completely divested of the political process is, I suppose, what I'm saying.
Yeah. And so I guess what are the other themes here? Because I guess in the anti-doping framework, that is really, to go to Caroline's earlier point, that is an individualistic regulatory framework because it's about you as an individual athlete. But that wasn't the only regulatory framework available to investigate and monitor this conduct, was it?
No, and I've been really mulling on this one because one of the reasons why we started doing this series is because there was the blow up about the AFL's illicit drugs policy, and I'm not sure if anyone has been following this as closely as I have, but for those who haven't, probably no.
No, for listeners, it would be hard.
Always assume that the answer to that question is no.
Anyway, so the recent controversy in relation to the illicit drugs policy is that WADA has a kind of rule that if you take an illicit drug, you're in contravention of WADA anti-doping, right? The AFL has a separate rule, which is a 3 strikes and you're out rule, which is a kind of balancing between the sort of harm minimisation of, so if you get an illicit drugs thing, you keep it confidential the first time you're sent off to counselling, and then if you kind of do it 3 times, it becomes public or something. I'm not getting the detail right, but you get the thing. But what came out more recently...
Yeah. So what you're saying is Mad Monday is out of scope.
Yeah. Well, what has come out more recently is that even in addition to the written down 3 strikes you're out, well, AFL has been operating a practice across clubs with apparently quite explicit endorsement. That is, if you know your player took the cocaine on Saturday night and they're about to get caught in an illicit drug test, you rest them for a twanged hammy or they've come up with general soreness. A groin injury, lots of groin injuries. And so people are kind of outraged by this, right? Because, in one way the clubs are lying to the punters about, why so-and-so isn't playing, and they're also doing it to avoid this 3 strikes you're out. But the nuance in it, and coming back to your question, I am getting there, Alison. The nuance in it that I find really interesting is that the AFL's response is self-righteous, as often their responses are, because they're sort of saying, well, you don't think the AFL is...
Shocked.
Knocked Alison over with a feather. But they're saying, actually what we are doing is thinking about our medical professional, so the medical professionals working with the individual is thinking about that person's well-being. We're thinking about mental health. We're thinking about, what you might frame as a harm prevention framework. And so I think it's this really interesting thing where you've got a number of different legislative and regulatory situations coming in, like literally criminal law because they're illegal drugs, WADA, and the kind of health profession all coming into this kind of complicated space. And then who is determining what to do? It's actually not government at all. It's the AFL. Anyway, in this Asada case, I think, you can see...
Can we really suggest that that's about the health and well-being of players so much as about the ability to, keep the code and the game and its players in high repute with families and children and sponsors?
I welcome thoughts.
Also, the word illicit, just by the way, does give away part of the game, which is it is regulated. There's a whole other element of what is of what regulatory system exists. I'm just saying the drugs are illegal.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah. I think though, but to your question, Alison, about what the interest is, I think, it can be both, right? Like the AFL can be both interested in the health and welfare of its players and interested in the reputational damage being done to it. And that was our gateway to this.
Sure, I don't disagree, but I think resting players for a twang tammy so that they don't ping the illicit drugs test is clearly one and not the other.
Well, it's certainly, if it's the other, it's a very paternalistic way of looking at the well-being of the player, because it's sort of saying we think that we can look after you in this other way and drive you in a different direction through our use of, soft counselling and not being on the records and the books about it. And I think there's a number of players' families who say that in essence how this plays out is that their son had a untreated chronic addiction for a number of years and ruined their lives. So there's a, I agree. Agrees both ways.
And part of that is because we don't have a framework that is agreed and everyone's sticking to. So the only way that can happen is if everyone thinks we're running the 3 strikes policy, but we're not. And that's not uncommon in heaps of regulatory systems. What we say is X. What we actually either are resourced to do, or in this case perhaps in our best interest to do, is Y. And so any system like this needs to be very transparent.
Is work health and safety the right framework to be thinking about this in their employees?
Yeah, I actually really think, if I was going back to 2013 and providing advice as the Deputy Secretary in the department to the Commonwealth Minister, I genuinely think now, with what I know now, not putting myself magically in that situation with what was known then, I think I would say this is primarily a matter of work health safety. This is primarily a matter of a club not looking after the interests of its players. If we go after this as an anti-doping question, we will end up pursuing the most powerless within this context, and we'll be doing it in a regulatory framework that doesn't have sufficient powers of compulsion and evidence gathering, although there's been a few work health safety investigations recently that have shown that we're not excellent at using those powers and evidence gathering there anyway. But I think I would frame it as a work health safety because that's where I feel like the moral injury is. But I'm interested in other people's thoughts about that.
Again, I think that there is more... So I don't know about the WHS. I don't have a particularly strong view about it. I think it's interesting how often we don't use WHS and employment law in lots of situations, and we come at it from defamation, all sorts of other things we use instead of WHS and an employment law system. And I think part of it is that the WHS part of it is regarded by the person injured in the situation to be kind of really complicated and hard and gives you a reputation and all of those kinds of things. So I think that some of it's about the optics of WHS.
Not very sexy either.
No,
If you're a politician and you've got potentially doping football players, come
off
on.
to work cover you go. I
Yeah.
mean, you know.
And don't you think foundationally in this particular case, I am the Commonwealth Minister for Justice. I don't want to refer it to some tin pot state jurisdiction of WorkSafe Victoria. They're not the people who are going to give me a sexy headline. Like, I genuinely think that's why as a Commonwealth public servant, you might not say that.
But then who decides? This is where you get into this thing of who decides whether it is this or it's that. How is this stuff getting into the country? Is organised crime involved? Is this something that should be the AFP? Hold up. What is APRA's response to doctors using cutting edge, for want of a better word, poorly regulated treatments? It's so common that you have a situation where there can be multiple regulators involved, and the worst ones are always when there are two jurisdictions involved. It's bad enough when you have multiple regulators in the same jurisdiction. It's really hard when you have and you have to decide. And often, I mean, I think I made the joke in the last one, it's getting Al Capone for tax evasion, but sometimes it is which regulatory system do we have the better evidence for, which regulatory system will be the easiest, and what we're trying to do here is the consequence, and this road gets us the consequence. This one over here might even fit better, but for whatever reason, it's not going to be an easy enough road to get a consequence with. And so I think it's really hard. And the thing is, no one person decides those things. So it's government collaborating again, it's regulators collaborating again. It's like, are you going in first? Are we going in together? And it's very rare.
Are we going after the same people for the same things, or different people for different things, or the same people for different things, or
Or my favourite one, which has happened to me a number of times, when you discover that you are not the only regulator in the room, where you're doing your bit. Did you do X? We've had a report of Y and a complaint of such and such. And you find that the cops are coming around the back door and the ATO's coming in another one. Yeah. And you're like, well, I'm not the only show in town here now.
And sometimes the hierarchy is obvious, right? Like the cops outdo you every time. Like, so you're like, yep, the cops go first. And in this case, ASCC reports to the board of the Australian Crime Commission, which is all the police commissioners, right? So like the cops had their first go, but no one sat down then and did that mapping through of thinking through, well, what are the various elements through which we should do and who should we progress it? So I think for me, I really take that as a learning from this particular context is both for individual regulators, but much more for people in policy agencies that are going to have, if anything, the best oversight of this kind of thing. Like I worked in a central environment department once, which had a range of different regulators kind of sitting in and nested in the department. And it was the central policy areas that knew, oh my gosh, there's this thing happening on a block of land out somewhere and it's sort of a native veg and it's sort of a land issue, a water issue, and kind of what are you know, I think it's incumbent upon the policy people to do exactly the thing Danielle just said, think through what are the different layers, and then you can't direct them, or maybe you can, again, it depends on the act, but I think having a conscious and mindful and open conversation about it is probably the best advice.
Do we recruit people to regulator roles who think like that?
It's a fair question, Danielle.
Good question, well asked. No, we don't. Because honestly, they're cops, like it's a black and white.
Sometimes they are ex-police. Otherwise, I mean, I find regulators stay regulators, so that's what they do most of their career. So they're not the kind of, I don't tend to find regulators. They might move the thing that they regulate and all of that type of thing, but not necessarily move from that into policy or other types of roles, and are trained to think, and they often have to brief, say, a Crown, where the way that needs to be set out is the offence in the act, whatever that offence is, clearing native veg or whatever else. We don't train them to do that. So when us policy floaters come floating in with this is really nuanced and grey. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's not what the Parliament thought, so tough.
I'm not sure that is well received by people with strong regulatory skills, in my experience.
But also I think, there is, just to go to your, everyone's got a different act, and the method of regulation and what we're regulating and how is different in everyone, because at every stage the Parliament was comprised differently and there were different interests, and I don't know, there are sometimes these external observers to government who want everything to be this like perfectly uniform system that doesn't recognise the role of elected officials in building out those systems. Anyway, that's my reflection.
Customers or clients or complainants think that you as the government regulator wrote the blooming act, and it's like, look, can't tell anyone, but I wouldn't have put that line in there either because no one really knows what it means.
We've talked about, I guess, the difficulty of choosing the right regulatory environment. Another thing that was pointed out by one of our excellent listeners, who we won't name, but shout out, you know who you are, is that there's a challenge of settings that we had never really considered regulated environments before, but that are increasingly being thought of in that context, probably rightly. So we see it in the questions now being raised about workplace safety in Parliament, in courts, on the footy field. How do and should regulatory systems cope with this kind of creeping expansion of their remit?
So, one reflection I have about this is that I think as public servants, sometimes we think we have to have been perfect all the time, and there's a we should have known that work health safety would come to apply in Parliament, and we should have got ahead of that. We should have known that we would need to apply this framework in footy and got ahead of that. But actually, I think, the gem of the system you just described, Alison, with the kind of both the political impetus and the way it kind of builds over time through layers of legislation, is that we do have a flexible system that can accommodate change. So I think as a regulator, I don't think you can get too far ahead of where you are, because if you do, you're in serious danger of regulatory overreach, right? You might think, I think that is going to be a place where we need to be regulated. But if the community expectation is not there, if that is not where people are thinking that, we don't think of Parliament as a normal workplace, for example, then I'm not sure it's helpful to come at that from a regulatory perspective. And then you have these awful moments where you get the kind of the contrast that really makes everyone rethink their expectations. And I think Brittany Higgins is just one example of where we suddenly all went, oh, it's bonkers that we think it's okay to have this drinking culture in a workplace where, and I think that contrast is kind of is the place where that should happen, and I don't know about being ahead of it. But maybe that's just my conservative tendencies.
Yeah, because I don't know that you can predict that mismatch between community expectation and, because to go to Danielle's point, all regulation is about community expectation of reasonableness and fairness and I don't know that you can foresee all of those things.
Also, some places are very special and some places are very powerful. So what you do find with regulation is if we're regulating something for the first time, we usually start with the low-hanging fruit. Look at it this way. It would have been very unusual when we were beefing up WHS rules, particularly in relation to, say, gender and sexual harassment, if the first place we went to try those was a court system, an AFL system, or a Parliament, because you have to have gotten very good at applying your regulatory system before you do it in a really
tricky
public
environment
and risky way. So there will always be last bastions of scope creep or things that are included, and they will usually be the trickiest ones because you do have to learn how to apply. Yes, there's the Act. the how, the where, the what, the procedure under it, all of that kind of thing. You have to try it, and sometimes it's like, oh, that didn't work. We should have talked to this person before that person, and we'll have to redo that procedure now. You don't test that out by trundling into a court or a parliament or the AFL. And at this point, I'm actually not sure which one of them in the Australian kind of zeitgeist.
Definitely the AFL.
Which is bigger? I'm not sure.
Definitely the most powerful is the AFL. I wonder as well if that's where some of the political scepticism comes around from this particular Asada case. You know, like it's very clear that the incoming coalition government at the end of 2013 thought that the whole Essendon investigation was a political beat-up, and they thought it was massive overreach on the part of the Commonwealth government. And like even to the extent that they kind of pushed the Rudd-Gillard government pushed through legislation in late 2013 to expand Asada's powers, and the coalition issue a kind of scathing minority report in the parliamentary committee inquiry where they just sort of say, we don't need to keep giving regulators more and more power. Like, you know, actually anti-doping is not, you know, a thing where we're really happy to accept having everyone's rights and rights limited in this way and invaded in this way. You know, when you give power, you need to give it up. So I feel like you really feel that tension in this case where it isn't yet a community agreed position that you should be fiddling so closely in this part of the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's right. I think that's right. I think that the last thing I think about this is we were just talking about how the regulations are made, Alison, and what a parliament is it's not a fast process, and frequently technology and culture moves faster than we regulate it. And so you can be in the position where you work on the consultation for an act for a year. It takes you to get through the parliament. By the time the governor puts a signature on it, you're like, oh no, they've invented a new thing that's not covered by this winner. Yeah. And that's why, you know, there's always handy to have either powers and also having regs that you can update to meet these things. But I think a lot of in this Asada one, you know, what is prohibited, what's not prohibited, is it on the list, what's the list, who's got the list, what's the molecule? Clearly, like the acts and the systems could not keep pace with them, and I don't think that's uncommon. I think so. In liquor, you are usually, I think it's every jurisdiction, not allowed to advertise or have products that are attractive to minors. And so the minute you kind of very specifically prohibit jelly, because that's for children, they come up with Jell-O. And so...
Yes, I've always said this to people who think that there is a general lack of innovation and creativity in the wider populace of Australia. All you need to give them is a set of rules and you will see some innovation and creativity applied. Find a loophole.
I mean, my son's favourite habit at the dinner table is to say, what's this law? And then tell me 15 ways that you could potentially go around it. So I agree that innovation is alive and well. And so the technology keeps moving. And, I mean, vaping's another example. I mean, I remember conversations, I don't know, 7, 8, 10 years ago, that'll never take off. That's so stupid. Why would you regulate it? Like, what even is it? And then it escapes you a little bit, and then you have to make a decision about how are we going to control it. Will we control it the same way we do smoking? Will it have its own system? And now we've decided to treat it like something else that's not the same as smoking. Now, I have no view on the evidence of that, but it's more that the technology and the innovation keeps turning up, and our systems are written, and they're a system of consensus and collaboration, and so those acts have really odd things in them sometimes that restrict you from adapting your practice because you've been locked down by the parliament from adapting your practice, and that's perfectly appropriate. But it does mean that regulators do find weird molecules missing and vaping and, you know, all sorts of things that turn up that are actually just not covered, and it's not a quick process to resolve that for the community.
Yeah. Drafting COVID directions was a very similar experience as well, of even you would draft pretty simple things. You can only do this inside and that outside, and we would have a hotline of people calling in saying, what's outside? How are we defining outside?
Which is not as stupid a question as one might imagine, because, like, you know, I have an enclosed veranda.
It's not, but then...
enclosed veranda outside.
Exactly. But then you end up, exactly to Danielle's point, writing in these like hyper-specific, it's not jelly, but then another example crops up. And so how do you kind of keep it at a broad and generally applicable level while accounting for nuance? I think it's a challenge.
It's really difficult. And you also can't give regulators too much power, right? Like it's, again, we're back to it is a community expectation fairness system. So you can't leave it so loose that it's like, well, the person on the day will decide what's inside and outside, and that's arbitrary. So you do still have to define it. But the minute you define it, anything new is usually not captured by it.
Yep. All right, so this is our last episode involving footy, at least until Danielle has her way. Our next few episodes involve Danielle interviewing former Public Service Commissioner Andrew Podger about more familiar robo-debt territory. Till next time.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. Those of us in the employ of the state government speak in a strictly personal capacity, consistent with the Public Sector Code of Ethics that permits public servants to promote an outcome in relation to an issue of public interest, in this case, the betterment of the public service. Nothing we say should be taken as representing the views of the government or our employers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.